Well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to talk to the group, and thanks for putting me before Greg Duncan. That is not an act anybody wants to follow. So, as you heard, my work is about health disparities in childhood. We're particularly interested in understanding the childhood origins of cardiometabolic health disparities and respiratory health disparities. I'll be telling you about some of our work today. I'm sure members of the panel are quite familiar with the evidence linking low childhood SES to a variety of acute and chronic health problems across the lifespan. It is a long list, and the evidence is strong. I'm sure the committee is also familiar with the evidence that upward socioeconomic mobility attenuates these effects somewhat, but not strongly. It has some offsetting effects. I'm not going to focus here on the epidemiology because that's not my understanding of what you wanted to hear about. I'll just tell you some about our work and I think stuff that's relevant to what you're considering. A lot of our work focuses on understanding biological mechanisms involved in the relationship between childhood SES and health problems. I'm not going to focus much on mechanisms during the talk, but I'm happy to answer questions in that arena should they arise. A second aim of our work is really to try to understand protective and vulnerability factors that moderate the relationship between childhood socioeconomic status and health problems. I'm going to be focusing heavily on that work and also on trying to glean some insights about policy and practice from that work. Let's see, I'll go ahead and get started. So one of the major thrusts of our research program, as I said, has been trying to understand protective and vulnerability factors. We've done, as have others, a lot of observational long-term studies showing that the relationship between low childhood SES and later health problems, particularly in the cardiometabolic domain, is moderated by early caregiving. So some examples of those findings are work we've done and others have done in MIDUS, which is a large epidemiologic study of midlife American adults. In an early paper, we showed in that data set that there was a strong linear relationship between childhood SES, as represented by parental education, and metabolic syndrome prevalence at midlife. And as you can see in this figure, that slope is relatively steep for people who report having low levels of maternal nurturants and other forms of early caregiving. But that slope is pretty much flat for participants who recall having high levels of maternal nurturants and other forms of positive engaged caregiving. Other studies have shown this same pattern with different cardiometabolic outcomes and different measures of early caregiving. A lot of this work is retrospective, but it's increasingly been replicated and substantiated in prospective longitudinal studies across adolescence. Just to show you the breadth of the evidence, here are data that we're writing up right now, where young adults are given a viral challenge. So they're given nasal drops containing a rhinovirus and then quarantined for 5 days to look to see who develops signs and symptoms of upper respiratory infection. And we see the same basic pattern here, which is that low childhood socioeconomic status, here focused on parental homeownership, is predictive of who develops signs and symptoms at the polls following this respiratory virus challenge. But that slope is steep and significant only for those who recall having low levels of maternal and we see paternal effects here to care. The slope is 0 for those who report having high levels of maternal care. And I could go through multiple studies like this with different health outcomes and different measures and different designs that show the same basic pattern, but I don't think any of you is going to be totally convinced, nor are we, until you see some kind of experimental manipulation of caregiving. These studies are hard to do. A lot of what's happening right now in the field is going back and following up children who are now adults who participated in these kinds of psychosocial family strengthening interventions early in life. We've been involved in some of that work along with a colleague at the University of Georgia named Gene Brody. Some of you may know that Gene's work has focused on low-income African Americans in small towns in the rural South. He did an intervention study about 15 years ago that focused on 11-year-old children and their caregivers, who were typically mothers. The intervention was initially aimed at improving academic outcomes, reducing drug abuse and other externalizing problems. And it involved 8 weekly sessions led by community facilitators in each of the small rural towns involved. And each of the 8 sessions lasted for 2 hours. For the first hour, the caregivers went with a community facilitator and focused on parenting during the transition to adolescence, with an emphasis on promoting engaged and vigilant yet supportive parenting, directly confronting the challenges of the transition into adolescence, particularly the challenges that are unique to African Americans growing up in the rural South. The kids went their own way with a different facilitator. They focused on goal setting, on coping with peer stress, on the importance of following family rules, routines. And then after those 1-hour sessions, the parents and the children came together for a series of role-playing exercises most weeks around communication skills. That cohort is continuing to be followed. The intervention was quite effective at reducing drug use and improving most psychosocial and academic outcomes. We picked them up 8 years after the intervention had done, collected blood in their homes, and looked at concentrations of inflammatory cytokines that play a role in the pathogenesis of various cardiometabolic diseases that we're interested in over the long term. Just to give you a feel for the sample, this slide shows you that it's a fairly low income at-risk sample, at least in terms of classic demographic indicators on income to needs ratio, household structure, parental education. And what we saw 8 years after the intervention was that children who had participated at 11 years old, 8 years later, showed lower concentrations of 6 different biomarkers of low-grade inflammation. The effect sizes here in standard deviation units were around the 0.4 to 0.6 range, depending on which inflammatory biomarker you're looking at. When we went back and did some structural equation modeling to try and understand how the intervention related to these outcomes 8 years later, part of the difference between the groups 8 years later is explained by changes in parenting. So from pre to post intervention, there are multiple measures of parenting from multiple informants. And what we see is that parents who increase the amount of nurturant engaged parenting from pre to post intervention and simultaneously decrease the amount of harsh, inconsistent parenting were most likely to have children who went on to have low levels of inflammatory biomarkers, more similar at age 19. Now, parenting doesn't explain all of that association. There's clearly changes in the children themselves and in other relevant pathways. But I think a take-home point here that's important is that an intervention during this transition into adolescence is associated with reductions in inflammatory cytokines quite a ways later. We've gone on subsequently to look at other outcomes, things like glucose intolerance, metabolic syndrome prevalence, various indices of prefrontal cortex function and hippocampal development. And consistently across these different measures of physical health and brain structure and some indices of brain function, we see that the intervention at age 11 is associated with favorable health outcomes for these participants who were 11 at the time, but now are in their late 20s and early 30s. So the intervention seems to be having long-term effects. Of course, one would want to do this intervention from the get-go with these health markers as a priori endpoints, and we're starting to do some of that work. As you can imagine, though, it takes a while to mobilize that, but we should hopefully a few years from now have some answers in a truly prospective trial where these outcomes were planned a priori. There's also interesting evidence that from emerging evidence from the health literature that While early caregiving relationships seem to be quite important at offsetting some of the negative health effects associated with childhood disadvantage, that it's possible to leverage other relationships, not just caregiver relationships, maybe peer relationships too. Here are some provocative data. I have a conflict of interest here. These data aren't actually mine, but they're my wife's, who's my best collaborator. This is a small study of about 100 10th graders at a low-income school in Vancouver who were randomly assigned to engage in weekly mentoring versus a waitlist control condition. And the mentoring was these 10th graders mentoring low-income 4th and 5th graders from an elementary school that was nearby. And the endpoints here were indicators of cardiometabolic risk in 10th grade. And what you can see here from this slide is that if you look at the group's post-intervention, this lasted for a semester, the group who does the mentoring shows lower levels of inflammatory biomarkers, IL-6 and CRP, lower cholesterol, and also lower body mass index. So this is interesting preliminary evidence from a methodologically strong design, although the sample size is small. It's preliminary, suggesting that other forms of social relationships and engaging in mentoring behaviors can be associated with positive health outcomes. We currently have an NIH-funded large trial of mentoring that just is going into the field right now here in Chicago, where we're having first-generation college students who are 18 and 19 years old mentor children who are in the 5th and 6th grade and are living in a very disadvantaged neighborhood in Chicago. And the focus, the endpoints are cardiometabolic health for both the mentors and the mentees. So 5-7 years from now, your report will be long done by then, but we should have some evidence that speaks to whether other kinds of social relationships can play similarly health-promoting roles for children and young adults who are socially disadvantaged. I've told you about some of our work on nurturant caregiving. Those effects are fairly straightforward, as you've seen, and fairly consistent with what one might expect to be the case based on the broader developmental psychopathology literature, where nurturant caregiving and other close relationships seem to be strong buffers against a variety of different psychosocial and academic outcomes that are usually associated with disadvantage. In another line of work, we've asked whether another moderator that's commonly studied in the developmental psychopathology literature, self-control, is similarly associated with better physical health outcomes. Does it act as a buffer or an offsetting effect? And I'm not going to focus on too much here other than to sort of tell you the punchline, which is that we don't see those sorts of buffering effects for self-control with physical health. In fact, we see quite the opposite. Some of you may have seen this op-ed that we had in the Times several years ago about upward mobility and self-control and health. The punchline of this work, at least in our hands, seems to be that while self-control is beneficial for disadvantaged kids in terms of promoting positive academic outcomes and good mental health, it's associated in the opposite direction with physical health. So let me show you a little bit of the data. So our initial findings here were from cohorts in rural towns in Georgia. So again, these are some of Jean Brody's studies, not the same sample I showed you earlier, but just to give you a flavor, here are some data from a longitudinal study where we're measuring family socioeconomic conditions and self-control between ages 17 and 19, and then psychosocial outcomes across the same period, and then stretching into age 20. And if what we did here is some latent variable analysis, I guess the best way to get you to imagine it is imagine that you have two continuous variables, family socioeconomic conditions and self-control, both reported longitudinally, both reported across multiple informants, and you form essentially a 2x2 matrix by crossing high and low socioeconomic status and high and low self-control. When you do that and you trace out psychosocial trajectories, what you see very consistently is that self-control is what matters. The kids who have high levels of self-control, as rated by their teachers and their parents, do better psychosocially over this period. And that's regardless of their family's socioeconomic conditions. They have less substance abuse, they have fewer internalizing symptoms, and they have less aggressive behavior. So self-control really seems to be kind of what carries the day here, not socioeconomic status. And seeing these data, we thought, and I think many of people would think, health is going to go in the same direction. But when we looked at health indicators, and this is just one example of a study we've done, that's not the case. Here are some data on cellular aging using DNA methylation patterns to index it. And what you can see here is this crossover interaction where high levels of self-control is associated with less cellular aging for the kids who come from relatively advantaged backgrounds. So again, this is not a particularly advantaged sample. It's low income African Americans from small rural towns in the South. But the kids who are generally from families that you might call working class or lower middle class, for them, self-control is associated with slower cellular aging, which is good, parallels their academic outcomes, parallels their psychosocial outcomes. But if you look at that green line there, the most disadvantaged kids in the sample, it goes the other direction. It fully crosses over. Self-control actually is associated with faster cellular aging at age 22. And we see this same exact crossover interaction when we look at metabolic syndrome, where we look at measures of allostatic load, where we look at measures of inflammatory cytokines, and in multiple physical health outcomes in the South Georgia sample, we see the same thing. So for the most disadvantaged kids, this one characteristic that's associated with better psychosocial and academic outcomes is simultaneously associated with worse indications of physical health or biomarkers associated with physical health. So when we initially had these findings come out, we did our best to replicate them in the samples we had available to us in South Georgia, but we were always a little bit wary of whether they might be a quirk of environmental circumstances in the rural South. And we didn't know whether they were representative. We didn't know whether they were unique to place, unique to class, unique to race, or just a quirk. So subsequently, we've done some further analyses with Kathy Harris on the Ad Health sample. And I'm sort of afraid to say we see the same pattern there. So this is a much larger nationally representative sample in a truly prospective study. What I'm going to show you here is the interaction between childhood disadvantage. This is a composite variable at the family, neighborhood, and school level between ages 13 and 18, and whether or not the respondent ever got a 4-year college degree. And what we're looking at is depressive symptoms in early adulthood. And what you can see here is, regardless of racial or ethnic group, going to college is associated with better mental health at age 24 to 32. So this isn't a surprising finding. There's nothing here that's going to shock you. It's consistent with all of our past work too, which is that self-control, academic success, better mental health, those things tend to stick together, regardless of racial and ethnic group or childhood disadvantage. But when we go to a measure of physical health, and here we're looking at the prevalence of metabolic syndrome at ages 24 to 32, again, we get these interactions, but we get them not for non-Hispanic whites, but for non-Hispanic Blacks, and for Hispanics, you see the same patterns that I showed you with epigenetic aging, and again, that I could show you with multiple other outcomes, which is that what we see here is for the most disadvantaged respondents, those who come from families with quite low incomes and neighborhoods with low median incomes, going to college is actually associated with a higher risk of having metabolic syndrome diagnosis between the ages of 24 and 32. And that's true for the Blacks in the sample, and it's true for the Hispanics in the sample. It's not true at all for the whites in the sample, for whom going to college seems to be fairly strongly associated with a reduced risk of metabolic syndrome. And it's certainly not true for the Blacks and the Hispanics in the sample who are at the midpoint or better of the childhood disadvantage scale. So again, this parallels the Georgia findings and other work we've done with infectious disease, suggesting that this pattern that we call skin deep resilience is evident in the most disadvantaged respondents of color we study, but only in them. Still, that doesn't make it any less troubling or worrisome of a pattern. I don't yet have any strong sense, because we're at the fairly early stages of this research, or suggestions for practice or policy that could offset this. We're still heavily in the business of trying to understand the boundary conditions of this phenomenon, looking at other samples to see if it emerges, trying to do some more in-depth developmental studies to look at this. Our suspicions, based on a lot of focus groups and some emerging analyses, is that there are a couple of possible explanations for what's going on here. We sort of divide them into two baskets of explanations that we're testing in ongoing prospective studies. So some of them have to do with hypotheses about the costs of hard striving, the sort of John Henryism traits that Sherman James has been talking about for 2 decades, and the amount of effort that perhaps first-generation minority college students from disadvantaged backgrounds have to put in to get to the same point academically as their peers who come from much more affluent and privileged and resource backgrounds. It could be that the effort required to get through college for some of these young people just saps their energy for sleep, for health practices, and for other kind of restorative behaviors that are associated with good health. There are also lots of very reasonable hypotheses about what we call the costs of arriving, so that it's not about the effort to get there so much as once one makes the upward mobility move, the environment in either the university or the workplace isn't one that is favorable and isn't one that leaves one feeling welcome, part of, engaged with, and that their struggles with alienation, discrimination in the workplace or school settings, juggling multiple social identities, juggling multiple social networks that value things quite differently. Consistent with this sort of climate or environmental explanation, we've been doing some longitudinal work with students of color in middle school here in Chicago. And one of the things that we found that's been pretty strong is that for students of color in middle school, how the school and the school district message values about diversity seems to be associated with physical health outcomes. So here are some interesting data that are kind of hot off the press, where we're looking at insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome in 8th graders at the school level. And what you can see from these data are that for students of color, being at a school that emphasizes the value of diversity, it doesn't have to be racial diversity. It can be diversity along socioeconomic lines or along sexual orientation lines. For students of color, going to a school that values diversity is associated with better cardiometabolic health. And this is independent of over a dozen family level and school level covariates that might pose alternative explanations here. For the white students, it actually seems to go the other way, that diversity is associated with worse health, which is actually quite consistent with a lot of the emerging literature in social psychology on the threat interpretations that white students often make when diversity comes up. Again, these are data from an ongoing longitudinal study. Obviously, we're not manipulating climate in schools yet, although we're trying to head in that direction to test these claims out in a more rigorous way that if it worked, would have implications for policy and practice. But we're not there yet. That is all I have to share right now. I'm happy to take questions, thank my collaborators, and let Greg get on with his talk.